Welcome to the podcast, Melody and Friends, where I will be taking a virtual tour around the world, interviewing all kinds of wonderful people like the person that I have here with us today. And we're actually going to dive into a conversation about narcissism and the church. And I can't think of a better person to have in the studio to talk about that other than Dr. Chuck DeGroat. So welcome.
Thank you, Melody. It's good to be with you. I think there are a lot more people, better people to talk about narcissism in the church, but I'll do my best.
Well, not only do I love that you've written this book, When Narcissism Comes to the Church, Chuck, but I love that you've been walking with people for decades about this. You've been walking with ministry leaders that are struggling with narcissistic personality disorder. And so that's why I feel like you bring this uniqueness to the table to talk about both what you have seen, what you have experienced yourself, how you're walking with people that are hurting, and then the book. This book is rich. And so, for those people that don't know anything about you, why don't you tell those listeners that may not know who Dr. Chuck DeGroat is about you?
Yeah. So I wear different hats, really. I mean, I was a pastor for a while. I served in churches in Orlando and San Francisco, where I started a couple of church-based counseling centers. And so I was in that kind of pastoral world, and yet always with the hat of a therapist on. And so, which is tricky, the kind of straddling both worlds and the dual relationships that can happen within the church. But I really wanted to bring the resource of good clinical counseling to the church in both places where I served. Most recently, I've been a professor for the last 8 years, where part of my call to this work is to help form women and men for ministry in a way that maybe looks a bit different than the kind of formation that has led to so much of what we're seeing in terms of narcissism and abuse in the church. And so to cultivate and form pastors who are humble and surrendered and curious. So that's been really good work over the last 8 years. I write books. I do podcasts like this with you and other things like that. But it's some fun hats that I get to wear.
And are you in Michigan now?
I'm in Michigan now. Yeah. I've been all over the country. Grew up on Long Island, went to college in Iowa, Chicago, Orlando, San Francisco, Michigan. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we know that narcissism almost gets abused a little bit as far as oh, he's a narcissist and she's a narcissist and all the things. But I would love for you just to kind of boil down, what is narcissism before we even go into how it shows up in church. But what would you say narcissism even is?
Yeah, well, so when we talk about narcissism, we're generally talking about kind of a pattern of behavior that people are feeling, seeing, experiencing in some way or another. If you go strictly by the kind of clinical diagnostic categories, the DSM-5 uses language like grandiosity, entitlement, attention seeking, a lack of empathy. And people can relate to that when they think about narcissism. I mean, this is a grandiose figure who may be a bit bullying, attention seeking, entitled. Yeah, we can sort of relate to that. The low empathy piece of it is always an interesting part for people to understand. That's that generally people who are narcissistic, and by the way, narcissism exists on a spectrum, but those who are narcissistically disordered really have an incapacity to get into the inner experience of someone else. It's really hard for them to understand. They may actually have, I talk about this in the book, they may actually have some psychological language that makes you think that they get people, but they really don't have the capacity to get outside of themselves, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, so we're talking about a kind of a pattern of relating, not just a one-off. I mean, we're all kind of arrogant at times in one-off kinds of ways, but we're talking about something that we see over time manifesting in what I call a debris field of damage, relationally, vocationally. A lot of the stories that we're seeing among pastors and leaders in the church, we're talking about profound harm that has been done in the name of God. from men and some women, but mostly men, to be honest, who exhibit this pattern, but interestingly do it in the name of God, often with credentials like ordination and seminary training and things like that, which makes it particularly dangerous, and the spiritual abuse particularly insidious.
Yeah, and we see, I mean, they're kind of two different. I mean, I know there's different types of narcissism, but I
Yeah,
think just from a in your face and not so much in your face, we see
yeah,
more like
yeah,
overt, almost like
yeah,
the bull in the china closet
yeah.
that's taking down people, and you see all these bloody
Yeah.
bodies behind you. And then there's also this more covert, maybe even passive
Yes.
aggressive covert,
Yeah.
that is almost like I'm going to hug you and stab you in the back at the same time, and it's really hard to see that. So talk a little bit
Yeah.
about those. I mean, they're very polar different, even though they both bring harm to
Yeah,
somebody.
that's right. That's right. And that first kind of description that I gave is typically what a grandiose and overt narcissist looks like, right? And covert narcissists don't look quite as grandiose. By the way, sometimes the language is vulnerable narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. The language is interesting depending on where you go and where you look. You'll find different language for it, but I love the description. It's a kind of hug you and stab you in the back. A grandiose narcissist is going to come, with their sword wielded from the front, right? And what's interesting about both is, if we're talking about men in particular, both are little boys, but one kind of protects the inner little boy with a kind of militant soldier kind of bullying grandiosity, right? And the other is passive aggressive, feels misunderstood, portrays himself as the victim. No one gets me. No one really knows how hard I work. No one knows how special I am. Um, and so it's there's still a superiority, but there's kind of a smug superiority, if that makes sense. There's a self-absorption. It's sort of like what can be tricky about this kind of narcissist is in his presence, he might use the kind of language that makes it sound like he's humble, thoughtful, curious, and yet it's all with a pull and a tug. It's about him ultimately. And so I love your description, though. Hug you and stab you in the back. It's just perfect.
Well, talk a little bit. I like how you said the word vulnerability. I mean, again,
Hmm.
I've kind of always heard overt, covert, but I like how you said grandiose and vulnerable. Vulnerable. Talk a little bit more like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? Because for somebody that doesn't have empathy and
Yeah.
can't walk into the shoes of another, vulnerability sounds like you can. So talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah, I've actually, in the book, I actually changed up the language and I've called it, and I've since found out that other people have used this word. I think it's a fun word. I don't know if I came across it from someone else or not, but I use the word vulnerability, FAUX. And I think that's a better way of talking about it
Oh,
because
that's so good.
it looks like vulnerability, right? I mean, this is why it's so confusing and crazy making for people in relationships with covert or vulnerable narcissist, because it's sort of like at times he can seem sensitive and introspective and connected and thoughtful, and yet the energy is always toward him, and it's never enough. And after a little while, it just feels like, well, wait a second, I'm being drained here in the relationship, and I'm always stepping on his toes. It seems like I'm always doing something wrong, or I'm never doing enough right.
Mhm.
Um, and and it comes back around to something about how I've hurt him over and over and over again. And so, yeah, there's a kind of I think vulnerable actually puts words to the kind of false vulnerability that you see that can be tricky to spot early on in a relationship with someone like this.
Well, and I like how you said the word drained.
Yeah,
A theme that I have as I walk with women is, I feel like the life is being sucked out of me.
yeah,
And
that's right.
that may even be like a red flag moment for you if you have,
Yeah,
if you're walking with people, like, why do I always feel tapped out, or why do I feel like the life's being
yeah,
sucked out of me, or why, that would be an alarm to go off of, like, okay, what's going on.
yeah.
Talk a little bit about, Chuck, why is this Why are we seeing so much of this in the church?
Yeah, that's a
I
good
mean, we know
question.
it's everywhere, but it seems very prevalent right now.
Yeah. Well, so in a sense, some form of narcissism has always been with us, right? I mean, I kind of tell the story from Genesis 3 on. And yet, I do think that there's this unique uh, moment that we're living in. And the moment isn't just a few years, but the moment has been like the last, let's just say 50 to 75 years. In this unique country in the world, right, the United States, that has this sense of manifest destiny. Americans, you go to, I lived in England for a summer. You go to England and they have this kind of awe shocks, like, yeah, we've kind of gotten beat up in the world kind of mentality. You come to the United States and we're the kings of the world, we're the great superpower. And it's really interesting that in the United States, the phenomenon of narcissism in the church really takes root in ways that seem to blossom, within the church planting movements. For instance, I've been a part of church planting movements for the last 25 years, and I've seen really good fruit come out of church planting. I'm not against church planting at all, but at the same time, I've often said that it's a kind of setup for a narcissistic leader. Even the assessments, even the kinds of things that we expect of them, the kinds of success, the metrics that we use, the descriptions of successful church planters. I mean, it's a setup, and so it, in a way, it's kind of baked into an American ethos, and then kind of an American evangelical ethos: bigger, better, stronger, faster. We have, interestingly, as followers of Jesus, we have a kind of messianic complex, a savior complex, right? It's paradoxical, it's contradictory, but we have this sense of, I was talking to a white church planter who said, 20 years ago, when I went into the particular city where I church planted, I thought I was going to be the savior of that city. And I never once thought about the many, let's say, Black churches in the city that had been there for generations. I never once thought to ask, what is Jesus doing through you? I just thought, I'd heard stories that this is an unchurched city, so I need to go in and save the city. So it's really sort of baked into American evangelicalism, an American ethos, a sense of manifest destiny, a sense, I think, an orientation toward victory, success, power, that is really kind of anti-gospel, and in a sense, I hope this isn't too strong, like anti-Christ, so not the way of Jesus, in other words.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know. Have you had the opportunity to listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill?
Yes. Yeah.
One like kind of like moment that I had in there of just like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that before. And I'm totally going to paraphrase what they were saying, but basically, back in the olden days, whatever, you had a church that you were pastoring, and maybe it started out small, but over time, you didn't really see a church grow into a large congregation 10, 20, maybe even 30 years.
Yeah.
And you're serving and you're shepherding and doing all the things. Well, now, because of the internet and Facebook Live and YouTube and all the things, you've got a church that may have taken 10, 15, 20, 30 years to grow, and that might be cut down to 5, 10 years to grow. And it said something like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, something about like the character at which the pastor is growing to the level of the growth in the church. That's the problem. That is a lot of the problem. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I love that, because I think one of the things you see in that podcast over and over again is we've prized charisma over character, right? Yeah. And I think about my work in the seminary. We've got these young students, sometimes in their mid to late 20s, early 30s. When I think about character isn't formed in a couple of years, 2, 3 years in seminary. Character is formed over a lifetime. Characters formed in the crucible of really honest relationships. Character is often formed in the midst of failure. And we put these young men in particular, and women too, into situations where they see success, and it happens pretty quickly. And by the way, with Diane Langberg, who, by the way, if you want to talk to someone who really gets this, I mean, we're all thinking Diane's thoughts after her. she's she's
Well, if you could hook me up with her, that would be amazing. I'm trying to
yeah,
get to her. I
yeah.
really am.
I mean, Diane is incredible and has taught so many of us so much. But Diane says with increased leadership responsibility is increased anxiety, right? And they often don't have the character, they don't have the maturity to handle uh, the um, the the increased responsibility. For instance, the I was just talking to a young pastor earlier who said I co-planted a church with a guy, and 10 years in, now we've got a staff of 15. And we started out together as good friends, but the more the church grew, the more aggressive and bullying he became. I would say the more insecure he became, the more anxious he became. And so
Right.
high control, high demands for loyalty, the same things that we saw in the rise and fall of Mars Hill, right? And
Yeah.
so often without any accountability.
Yeah.
Characters
That
formed.
makes me think of the girl that got fired. I mean, his assistant that got fired just simply for asking the question or answering the question of accountability. And so
Right.
as the church grows, probably does the accountability
Yeah.
and not those that are indebted to you, right?
Yeah. So when I think about character, for instance, one of the things that would be at the top of my list is humility, right? And humility as a capacity for curiosity, a capacity to say, so, your assistant comes to you and offers feedback. Tell me more about that. I'd like to hear how I hurt you. I'd like to hear what I missed. I want to learn about my blind spots. You're always welcome to come to me and share what's going on. I think a secure leader can do that. I think an insecure leader is ultimately using the flock for the advancement of his own agenda, the expansion of his own ego, and that's really, really dangerous.
So give an example of that, Chuck. So you just mentioned curiosity, humility. Tell me more about that. Tell me about my blind spots. What would that look like, from a narcissistic standpoint?
Well, a narcissistic leader wouldn't ask the questions, right? The narcissistic leader isn't curious. I think when I think about that, I think that's not just an exercise that you do. I've talked about this on other podcasts, and I remember someone saying, "Well, okay, so that's just something we do then. We should just ask questions like that." I said, "Well, I think that a question like that naturally comes out of one who's grown in maturity, grown in security, grown in a sense of himself, isn't so worried about what people think anymore, is really comfortable with, and isn't surprised at all when someone comes and says, hey, sometimes in staff meetings, you can be, a little edgy or a little passive aggressive or a little uptight. Oh yeah, I've heard that before. I think a mature leader would say, oh yeah, I've heard that before. But how have you experienced that? How have I hurt you? That's the kind of thing that I think we see so rarely, and they're not in the spotlight, right? And of course, if we did a podcast about that person, it'd have about 13 listens. It's not the sexy and salacious story,
Right.
but these are not people who are necessarily elevated to the spotlight, and probably not the churches that grow at the rate that we see other churches that are so committed to developing these, as you said, these kinds of large platforms. And and so
I love how you said, I think probably one of the best questions we can ask in our lives in all the areas, whether that's our spouse, our kids, ministry leaders, is how are you experiencing me?
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe even doing some work before you ask that question internally to be like, okay, I got my big boy pants on, or my big girl panties on. But talk a little bit more. One of the things that you talk, we've talked a little bit. I love how you talk in the book. I'm a Enneagram coach, so of course I loved when you went through the 9 types of everything. So you talk a little bit about the Enneagram and break that down, but then you move into characteristics of a narcissistic pastor, and then moving into systems. Let's talk a little bit about that. You had some great things to say.
Yeah. So first there, just on the Enneagram, just to touch on that for a moment, you and I talked about covert and overt, right? And I think the 9 habits of the Enneagram spell it sort of gives color and texture to this in a way that the binaries of covert and overt can't do, right? And so, because we see more grandiosity in some types than others, we see maybe more covert or vulnerable narcissism in other types. And so, for those of us who do Enneagram work with folks, it's we can't boil it down to well, it's just the 3s and the 8s and the 7s, who are the narcissists among us. Those 9s, those 4s, those 5s, watch out. Anyway, so there's that. I think in terms of the characteristics that we see in leaders and systems, I within the book, I've got about 10 of them, and I probably can't remember them off the top of my head, right? But we sort of identify things like bullying, impulsivity, inconsistency, demands for loyalty. These are characteristics of the kind of leader who doesn't manifest, as I said earlier, that kind of humility and security, right? An insecure leader is going to demand loyalty. An insecure leader is going to be wildly inconsistent, wildly impulsive in his leadership at times. An insecure leader will always be pulling from people in a marriage, from a spouse, in an organization, from a staff. And so then when we kind of generalize that to systems, these are systems that demand loyalty. These are systems where people who exist within these systems feel like there's no center, there's no core. We've got a mission statement, but we're all over the place. There's a sense within systems like this that of entitlement and of grandiosity. In this sense, I tell the story in the book, I think, of a friend of mine who went into a large Christian organization where a narcissistic leader had been leading and stepped aside, and that was actually an important process for the organization. But what he stepped into was a system that held so many of the values of that narcissistic leader, essentially sort of held the narcissism in the system. And so not more than 2 or 3 weeks in, he starts to hear from staff members, we have the best discipleship program in the United States. We have by far the best resources. Oh, that ministry down the street, they don't know what they're doing. They're kind of systemic narcissism. And yet a ministry that's sort of founded on kingdom of God, principles of the kingdom of God, serving our neighbors and things like that, and yet acting with a sense of entitlement, of grandiosity. And so and most people, they might not have the words that I kind of use in the book to define these things, but we kind of know it in our gut, right? You kind of know something's off, something's wrong. And that's what can be so crazy making when you're dealing with narcissism, whether in a person or a system. It's sort of like, I may not have the words, but something feels really off here.
That's really good. So if you were, I think this would be good to flesh out. If you were either, I know this sounds terrible too, vetting a church or vetting a, for work, for a faith family or whatever, that would probably be something that you'd want to maybe sit down with some deacons or some elders or church leaders, because I have found, when we have more of a spirit of collaboration, like usually a church might be really good in a couple areas, but a church that can say, wow, that church down the street, man, they really are good at outreach. And I see that's really a place that we could learn from that church, instead of that church just stinks at blah, blah, blah. What would that look like, Chuck, if you were looking at coming on staff at a church, or if you and your wife were visiting churches? Not that we can avoid, all the hurt, for the body of Christ, and we're all broken, but just what would that, could you give just some practicals as far as what that would look like?
So that's tricky, right? Because it's sort of like, I think of the metaphor of, you're going to buy a car and you find this nice, shiny, what appears to be a new car, but you open up the hood of the car and it's hollow. There's nothing there, right? I mean, it takes a while sometimes at a church to see underneath the surface. You might have a pastor that from the pulpit seems incredibly vulnerable, tell stories of his or her marriage or life in a way that seems appropriate and honest, and seems like a real authentic confession of sin. It might seem that the worship is really life-giving. And the mission statement, the vision statement, everything that you see, you might say, wow, this so aligns with who I know Jesus to be, the kingdom of God. And yet it takes a little bit of time to get to know a church, right? And just like it takes a little bit of time to get to know a future spouse or partner in ministry or someone like that. I was doing some work. I was asked to come into a church and do some assessment, right? And on the surface, this seemed like just the kind of gospel centered. They used all the right language, right? And I remember sitting down. And this was an egalitarian church that was going to embrace women in every way. And I remember sitting down with a female seminary intern and saying, "So tell me about your experience here." And at first, I could see the sort of terror in her eyes, and then tears began to flow. And she said, "Chuck, we talk about this being a place that's inclusive of someone like me, but this is an old boys club. What's written on paper isn't what functionally is happening within the life of our staff here and within the life of the system. This is a really oppressive place to work. And it's doubly oppressive because it's being done in the name of God. It's been being done with the sense that we are God's gift to this particular community, and God has enabled us and equipped us to do these incredible things. And of course, what we're doing are the fruits of God's Spirit in the work. She said it's vacuous, it's empty, and I'm not the only one. And so as I began to do my consultation work, I heard these stories told over and over again. And Melody, this is what's challenging, is as I asked people, well, how long did it take you to discover this? The earliest was I had my first intuition at about the 7 or 8 month mark. For most others, it was 3 years, it was 5 years, it was 7 years in, right? And so I often say, hey, listen, I've been doing this for a long time. I think I know what I'm doing, and yet I go in and I don't have a clue. It takes a little while for me to begin to sort of sniff it out, see what's really going on.
Yeah, because there is. I know I've been in some churches before where, kind of like you said, they say all the things and it smells good and charisma. And that lines right with my value system and all that. And maybe you go in and talk to some of them and they're like this. So you're like, oh, I feel seen and I feel heard and validated and all that. But then it may take you 6 months to go, wait, like we had this conversation and nothing is happening actionable, action wise to match the words. And that confusion piece, I just feel like it takes a really, really, really long time, right?
It takes a long time. And I think that for a lot of us who grew up in the church, depending on what tradition you grew up in, you were told, don't trust your gut, don't trust what you feel, don't trust your emotions, trust the authority figure, trust truth. And by the way, this solo white male leader, I'm the arbiter of truth, so it's as I define. And so you talk to people, even from a number of the stories that we've seen emerge over the last 5 years or so, you talk to people who've come out of systems like that, who are in those systems for 10 years, 15 years. You talk to people who've been in marriages for 15, 20, 25 years. And it's like, I just didn't trust my gut. I had a sense that something was off, but I was like the frog in that boiling kettle, right? And it just kept getting hotter and hotter. And at some point I was like, I'm boiling. This isn't good. I've got to get out of here. And that can take a long time.
I want to piggyback that. I love how you said the frog in the boiling pot, because you don't know. But when you look back, like you said, 10, 15 years, whether that's a marriage or a church, there's these little pieces over time that have been picked away. As a 7 on the Enneagram and a believer and a woman, I reframe. So a lot of my own personal harm that I brought to myself has been, well, wait, Chuck said this, but he's not doing this. But, God is working in Chuck. I believe in sanctification and transformation. So I believe that the same work that God's doing in me, he's also doing in Chuck. Or do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's almost like I dismiss myself because of things that I know to be true about the gospel. So talk to somebody like me. Is it innocent as a dove and wise as a serpent? I mean, is it one, like, we have to have them both,
That's right.
Teach me for a moment about, like, what does it look like to sit in the intuition and not reframe or not,
And this, this from your Enneagram work, right? This, and you just named it, this looks different for different Enneagram types. And so for a 7, who can be maybe a bit detached from reality, live in this kind of reframed, maybe a bit too optimistic reality. At times it's being anchored in the reality of the harder emotions and the more challenging bodily intuitions that, no, if I just think about it this way, maybe I can, no, actually, I want you to sit in some of the sadness for just a little bit, right? 4s are chronically self-sabotaging, and so they'll find their way to remain in a system where there's pain. And so we've got to sort of get to the core of that self-sabotage. Why do you go back over and over again, as scripture says, right, to the dog returning to its vomit, right? It's the 9 who has no sense of herself, right, who's kind of chronically dependent on the opinions of us. And so we sort of have to do the work of assessing. So how has this become for you a style of relating that works for you? I'm sure your 7ness has worked for you in some really incredible ways. Everyone loves Melody's 7ness, except when for you, it keeps you in a chronically unhealthy situation over time, right? And then you've got to ask yourself, how is that actually sabotaging the possibility of the real joy that I long for, right?
Yeah. Well, and to piggyback that, Chuck, it's like when I get to know you and I see you, like, part of my DNA is like, I see all the beautiful parts of Chuck. And I don't necessarily see the not so beautiful parts about Chuck. And I want to celebrate and encourage and, cheer you on in those beautiful parts. But what I've learned personally and through pain is ambivalence. I've got to love the beautiful parts of Chuck and the not so beautiful. And I have to sit and pay attention to those things because I tend to not. And I just want to be your cheerleader, but that could bring me harm, right?
That's right. Yeah. And to love all of you too, and to love yourself well enough to know when it's time to hit eject. I mean, I was talking to a beloved Enneagram 7 friend who was a staff member at a large church and refused to give up on a really toxic leader. Constantly came to me saying, but I see the goodness in him. I see the value of his ministry. And what I watched was him, even though he had this kind of relentless, vivacious energy, I watched him becoming more and more hollow, less and less himself. And I remember sitting with him at one point saying, where have you gone? Like, where are you? All you are now is the cheerleader, but I don't see you anymore. It's like you've been so diminished in this. And so, I mean, it cuts both ways, right? The cheerleading is such a beautiful thing. I'm sure it's something about you that people love, and yet we can be diminished in ways if we're not aware of the shadow side, the shadow side of things. Yeah.
So, like, some people say narcissists will never change. Like, I'd love to hear a little bit about your work, that you do with ministry leaders and church systems. I loved how you talked about going in and assessing, like tell me a little bit
Yeah.
about what all that looks like.
Yeah. So it's an interesting conversation, the whole narcissists don't change thing. And um, this is a tricky conversation. I remember before my book was published, I was in a conversation with a leader of the ministry in a different country who said, I can't endorse the work that you're doing because you think narcissists change, and I have to believe that I have to believe they're evil and they can't change, and the reality is I think my understanding of narcissism is not merely at the level of the patterns they live by or the symptoms that manifest, but that it's based in trauma, it's based in pain. I've done enough work over many years with narcissistic men and women in particular to know that that you don't wake up at the age of like 12 years old and say, I think I'll become a narcissist. I think that'll work for me. I remember doing this. I'll tell this story really briefly. I was doing work with a large church pastor, and this guy had been described as a bully, as a terrorist, and yet when about probably 4 or 5 sessions in, when I began to gain some trust with him, I got let into some profound pain from his childhood, some story of really awful sexual abuse, and that was incredibly painful for him to tell. And then I remember sort of toward the end of it, he said, and I think it was around that time that I said, never again. I will never let anyone get close again. And it's like he sort of put up the castle walls, armored himself. When I come at narcissism from a trauma-informed perspective, I have to believe that if people engage the reality of trauma in their lives, they can begin to find healing. Now, that healing doesn't come without accountability. You're probably going to need to step away from your church. You're probably going to need to be out of ministry, right? Yeah.
I love how you said that, because, if you keep somebody in a system where they suck supply from, all the things, like, does it look like taking them out and maybe they not scrub toilets or whatever, but just some, out of the public so they can really focus on those wounds and that identity, or what?
Yeah, it's not at all an absence of accountability, right? And so, it is stepping away to do that work. And the ones who I think I have the most hope for are the ones who are willing to step away and say, I think this rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than is that the right metaphor?
Yeah.
I hope this rabbit hole goes a lot deeper than I thought, and I've got a lot of work to do. There are plenty of stories where these guys just doubled down. I mean, I think that's the story that we're hearing about in the rise and fall of Mars Hill. I'm just going to pack my bags. I'm going to take my incredible gifts to the next church down there. I'm going to start my new church. I'm going to abandon the accountability process in this denomination, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to plant another church. And I have many stories to tell about that, where there may have been a moment there where these guys were open to possibly looking at the harm that they had caused, but when they realized that they might lose their careers, their influence, it was like, the way I like to put it is, who am I apart from my stage self? Like, Chuck, if you take that away from me, I'm nobody. So I can't bear the weight of failure, of loss, of that magnitude, right?
Yeah. So what does accountability look like? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, so accountability often depends on the severity of the violation, the harm, right? And so I'll do work in churches where there's a pretty immediate awareness, or within a few weeks of me doing the work within a church, there's a sense of, I've done this. Staff members are kind of afraid of me, and we will discern together. I think it'd be wise for you to take a 6-month sabbatical where you do some of your own intensive trauma counseling, where you have no sort of leadership during that time, where I do some assessment along the way, and then we reevaluate at this 6-month mark. And he might say, that sounds really good. And I'm thinking of one situation where there were tears and it felt like a relief. Like I finally get to do some work on my own
Mm.
life. And where at times these people come back with repentance, there are other times where the magnitude of the violation, uh, whether it's staff, congregation, sometimes sexual abuse, emotional abuse of some kind,
Yeah.
is so significant where they have to be out of ministry altogether.
Mhm.
Depending on denominational context or other like ecclesial context, there are judicial processes that they go through. And by the way, oftentimes denominations, presbyteries, episcopate, all these, they don't know what in the world they're doing when it comes to
Yeah.
this, because they don't really know what narcissism is and the insidiousness of it. But there has to be that level of accountability. And that's where you often get the pushback. Like, you're not going to take my way of living away from me, my influence, my authority, right? And so accountability really just depends on the severity of the violation.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit in your book too about like the deeper motivations, or really
Yeah.
ministry leaders asking themselves questions, that really get to some of those deeper motivations, like why do you even want to do this work? Why?
Yes.
Because I think there's probably in all of us, especially if we're empaths, there's probably some piece where we have a savior complex, like the good part of our heart of like we want to serve people and love people. But those deeper motivations, it's almost like it'd be awesome if there was a class in seminary, Chuck, where you taught it to where people could do that work. Because we're not always in touch with our motivations. That's why I love the Enneagram. Like, why do you do what you do?
Yeah, and that's a multi-layered process. I think you can do it. I think you could do part of it through a class. I think some of it has to be in through relationships. I know for me, it was a seminary professor. I was 27 years old, and he came to me and he said, "Chuck, if you continue on the way you are, I don't think you're a healthy person, and I think you'll be dangerous to the church." And that was a kind of direct confrontation of my arrogance and my, just the way I was showing up as a 27-year-old know-it-all. And the reality was, for me, I recognized the truth of that pretty quickly. I knew that there were some issues, and I needed to get into counseling. Thank the Lord. That's when I started doing my mental health counseling program as well. But I do think that after doing this seminary thing for the last 8 years, people slip through too. They're really good at kind of playing the game. I can't tell you how many stories I have over the years, not just the last 8 years, of, I love the Enneagram. I'll do my genogram, tell my family story. I go to therapy. And yet it's all kind of a ruse. And 3, 4, 5 years later, I get a call from a church saying, "Hey, didn't you give your thumbs up to this guy? He's a wreck and he's hurting us." I'm like, "Oh goodness. Okay. Well, I missed that one." And so we've got to have a lot of grace for ourselves, those of us who do this work. We don't always see it. We miss it. We're fooled.
Yes.
I can beat myself up when I'm fooled, when I get that phone call. I think, "Chuck, you don't know what the hell you're talking about," but sorry for the language. But that's just kind of how it is.
So good. So maybe speak to that person who is hurting at the hands of a narcissist or has been in a system. Like, what encouragement? Do you work with primarily ministry leaders, or do you actually work with people that have been hurt by narcissists, or what does that look like?
Yeah, well, so all the above. Yeah. And my time is limited, and so I can only do so much, but I do work with ministry leaders. There are pastors who contact me and say, "I've read your book and I resemble some of the things you say, and I think I'm ready to do some work." And that's always a really beautiful thing.
That is.
I've worked with a number of churches over the years who've asked me to come in and do some of the deeper assessment work, right? Or with church bodies that are trying to figure out how do we make sense of what we're seeing here and some of the complaints that have been made. And Melody, I mean, it's just always heartbreaking, right? I mean, it's always really hard, really heartbreaking work, eh, because you inevitably hear the stories of victims, of survivors of systems like this who, maybe you're hearing, maybe find in me the first person who takes their story seriously, which is kind of unbelievable at times, like, you actually believe me? Yeah, tell me more, and so,
You mean I'm not crazy?
you're not crazy, right? And so, um, there's not a one size fits all kind of
Yeah.
model of the work that I do, whether that's in one-on-one counseling, or within systems, because it often takes a long time to kind of detangle the knottedness of whether it's a person's insides or a system. And
Yeah.
it's hard work. And I can tell you right now, I mean, having when the book first came out, that was the beginning of COVID,
Yeah.
and mental health practitioners were getting lots of phone calls.
Mhm.
Now the mental health practitioners are looking for people to care for them. Like, I mean, I think those of us who do this work are really, really tired. And I know, like the rise and fall of Mars Hill, for instance, has led so many women and men into counseling, because they are recognizing their own stories. So I get calls from people like, I'm in rural Missouri and I'm listening to this podcast. I don't know if you've heard about it. And I think that's my story too. It's really painful.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like we need to create a counseling course for people healing from narcissistic personality disorder. Um, that may be the only way to clone you.
Oh no! Well, I'll tell you. There's some. I'll sometimes get correspondences from people who are like, your book is the only book, and you're the only person who understands. And that's when I say, well, hey, we've all been learning. In the late '90s, I was listening to audio cassette tapes of Diane Langberg. So, we've all been learning from Diane for years. I'm
Yeah.
so grateful that Wade Mullins' Something's Not Right book came out around the same time mine came out. Community Called Tove by Laura Berenger and Scott McKnight came out. There are some really great resources, really great therapists out there who are doing this work. I sometimes think, what I do think sometimes, to be honest with you, is I wish we could find a way to kind of join forces and do it together, and come up with the kinds of resources and tools that are really needed. An organization like Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments, is doing really fantastic work on this front. And so there are some really great organizations and resources out there. But it's I do wish there were more. People are crying out for more.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put together some things. We'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah. I mean, an online summit. I mean, kind of the beauty of some of the benefits of COVID is that people really learn to use the virtual space. And so there's a lot that can be done. But I guess if you're a listener out there and you have either walked with somebody that's been hurt, with somebody struggling with narcissistic personality disorder, or you have yourself been hurt, there's something powerful about getting to go into a counselor who may just be trauma informed. Maybe they don't necessarily work with narcissists, but somebody who's somewhat trauma informed that can help validate your story and really walk through this process.
Yeah.
Would there be any other insights that you would add to that, Chuck?
Yeah. No, that's really good. I think what you just named is often what I say is the first thing. Just find a trauma-informed therapist. And trauma-informed being the operative language there. There are lots of not so good therapists out there who simply do kind of cognitive behavioral, kind of mind-changing kind of work. I want people who are going to get into the stories of people who've been hurt, into the developmental trauma, and how it's impacted them, who'll take seriously physiology and how our body stores and holds trauma. And so, and most of those therapists understand that whether you call it narcissism or something else, we have to take the harm seriously.
Yeah.
So,
and there's not a timetable on healing, right?
There is not a timetable. I tell you, the night before my book was released, I woke up from some very real nightmares around a potential scenario that could unfold where people from my past would come after me, where I've experienced some narcissistic abuse. And it was like, probably a couple of decades after I'd experienced some of that, but it was like it was happening in the moment. And that's how trauma operates in the body, right? It impacts us in the present moment, as if something terrifying that happened 20 years ago is happening again right here and right now. And so, so that was a fitful sleep that night before and that's in part because my body was saying, hey, this is kind of terrifying to release a book out into the world. That's pretty vulnerable. That's pretty scary, Chuck. Are you ready for this? So, yeah.
Well, tell our listeners how to get in touch with you. I'll put this all in the show notes. I'll put the link to your book, all the things so that people can get in touch with you. But tell our listeners how to get in touch with you.
So my website is chuckdegroat.net. I'm on Twitter at Chuck DeGroat, DEGROAT, Instagram, Facebook, the same thing. And I try to post valuable thoughts and insights in those kinds of places, but that would be the best way to get in touch with me. Yeah. Okay.
That is awesome.
And thank you for the work that you do, Melody, for your advocacy, your work with women. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This is just so helpful. And again, just to have some space where we can talk about this and we can learn and grow. And, we either know somebody that may have walked through this, or we may be walking through it ourselves, but just, having the awareness and really getting to get some tools around this, I think can be really helpful. So thank you for joining us today. I'll put all the ways to get in touch with you in the show notes, but thank you again for the work that you're doing, not only, but also the read that you're allowing us to enjoy as well out of the work that you do. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you too. Let's stay in touch, Melody.
Okay. Awesome. Okay.